Hi everyone. So this is the last response of the semester, and the book that I chose was America on the Brink by Richard Beale Jr. And the quote that Dr. Palka wanted us to analyze is on page 2, which is his argument for the book. I shall argue that the Federalist behavior rather than the British actions was the critical factor propelling the Republicans to declare war in 1812 that the Federalists opposed. And in response to that, I want to answer this in 3 parts. The first, I believe, is that the Federalists had responded to the Republican government in these several legislative responses that they had from what the Republican government released during the years leading up to the War of 1812. And for instance, I wanted to start out with the Louisiana Purchase. I feel that the response that the Federalists gave during the administration's purchase of this land from France is how the Federalists similarly responded to in the later embargo and trade issues prior to the War of 1812. And so on page 22, the Federalist leaders construed the Louisiana Purchase as a violation of the compact between the original 13 states. Much of their opposition derived from the assumption that the West would be the Republican and thereby secure their opponents' power in perpetuity. And that it goes to show that the Federalists were very anti-French. They didn't believe in the French cause after their own revolution that they were turning into a very much anarchy type of society, and they did not agree with it. They felt that in the Republican government's desire to acquire this land by French, it secured those ties with them rather than sever them like the Federalists wanted to. And so not only were they out of fear of the Republicans, more people becoming Republicans in that area, but I feel like it was a failure on the part of the Federalist leaders that in responding this way, they shouldn't have done so. Maybe more of a private manner in like Congress or other smaller legislative meetings, but on a national scale, the way that they assume these, issues that went along with acquiring this land would cause further dissent among the on a national scale. And so, but I think on the part of the Republican government, they were thinking that acquiring this land would continue to grow the Republic as a country. And so that would in turn show with other foreign powers that the country was growing instead of just staying in the past as a colonial entity. And so I think that response from them kind of mirrors how they responded to other acts down the road, such as the Embargo Act of 1807 and the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809. And on page 89, the Federalists responded to this legislative manner in a similar way to the Louisiana Purchase. They said, the Federalists did nothing to diffuse the atmosphere of crisis that surrounded Madison's ascension to the presidency. Instead of letting non-intercourse stand as a humiliating confirmation that the Republicans could not be kicked into war, they continued to protest that the measure risked war with Britain. But since Britain had declined to use the embargo as a pretext for retaliating against the United States, either militarily or commercially, she was unlikely to do so in response to non-intercourse. And I think this quote reciprocates what happened during the Louisiana Purchase again, that the Federalists neglected to respond in an adequate manner, that they effectively did not help the cause of the government. They did not back them in a good manner. They just stated that it's pretty much on their own hands the way that they did certain acts. They didn't diffuse the situation of by creating these embargoes in the first place, and they shouldn't have been there in the first place. But on the Republican side, they were coming at these acts were supposed to avoid a war, but essentially it, due to the responses from the Federalists, that kind of boosted the morale for why the Republicans were, okay, well, maybe the embargoes didn't work, maybe going to into a war with Britain will settle these disagreements going on. And so I think that's one way that the Federalists contributed to the wartime affair. And so I think another way that they did get involved in the situation was utilizing media outlets. And for instance, throughout the book, the role of media played a huge factor in getting information out there, for one, among Americans, but it also was used as a way on both the Republican side and the Federalist side to respond to legislative decisions or to comment on affairs concerning national or international affairs. And so, especially in the case of the Federalists, they responded to these attitudes of the Republican government. For instance, on 134, it stated that the Federalist newspapers taunted the Republicans with the prospect that changing the direction now might inflict on the Republicans the same political damage that Adams and his supporters had experienced in 1800. And a little bit down further, other Federalists like Alexander L. Hansen, the aristocratic editor of the Baltimore Federal Republican, advocated raising the ante on the Republicans by endorsing the warlike preparations the Foreign Relations Committee had called as far as they go. But Hansen added they were materially inadequate for conquering Canada. And so, commenting about the way the Republicans went to war, it reciprocates that they were using these news outlets as a response to further, I guess, disagreements among the American people, as well as further isolate themselves with the Republican government, is what I got from this, that these news outlets severely had impact on the way the stability of the government had prior to the War of 1812. And I think if they didn't utilize these news outlets in the way that they did, then it might have changed the way or the attitude or the national attitude on how the war should have gone about, in that this effective use of these news outlets was what also contributed to the Federalists' decisions to effectively help the Republican government. And so that also leads me to my last claim about this, and I feel like the Federalists pretty much were deflective towards these wartime needs, that they very I don't know, they were very defensive about a lot of things, and I feel like very much, in a sense, they were very hypocritical about the way they would speak about one legislative decision and then go back and turn it around and say something else. For instance, you can talk about at the Hartford Convention even, the Federalists throughout this war were wanting to prevent it, and they felt that these acts were supposed to stop that, but they epically failed. And so on page 229, the Federalists were, in a sense, undercutting the peace negotiations going on. It it states that in this, Britain served her own interests well, but left her American allies in the lurch. Nothing could have undercut the Hartford Convention's proceedings more effectively than a peace with Britain that got the administration off the hook with honor. The Federalists now look like a disloyal minority intent on promoting their own interests at the nation's expense. And so, not only was you talked about secession in your video, Dr. Pockle, but then it also goes to the fact that the Federalists here were not in sync with the Republicans at this at the Hartford Convention. That they felt that the British and the French should have been punished further instead of having this as a result of the Treaty of Ghent and restoring the pre-war status quo on page 229. Like I said, they wanted to, I guess, destabilize that, and they wanted to further this notion of undercutting the Republican government again, and it shows that they wanted power they were looking for their own self instead of looking out for the national security. And so I think Beale throughout this book argued an effective manner that through these different outlets of not being in sync with the Republican government, those are what led to the ultimate disconnect within the government. And so I think he did, at the end of the day, bring together a good cohesive book, and I understood further how the political implications that were going on behind the scenes in America is what kind of led to what happened in the War of 1812 and why it even took place. And I don't know, I think, like, although I think the language a little bit, it kind of threw me off. He would just, I think he would float around back and forth between ideas, and that caught me off guard a little bit. But like, for instance, he would just talk about I don't know, one person, and then go to directly go attention to another. And I think that's what threw me off a little bit throughout the reading. But I think because it was just such a narrative approach for this, for the way he argued his points. But I think at the end of the day, he did argue why it was important to reflect upon the instability and the ineffectiveness that the Federalists were against the Republican government in the first place. And so I look forward to everybody else's responses, and I hope you all have a great week.